Welcome to Adolescent Development and Learning. This is SEDF 714. My name is Camila Torres. I'll be an instructor for this course. I want to let you know that this is a completely online course. So in order to give you the full course experience, I've created something that has a little bit of video. We'll be working with a program called Perusal to annotate, and you'll be submitting your assignments through Blackboard. If at any time you need to get a hold of me, if you're struggling with technology or you just have some questions about the course, you can reach me at my Hunter email, which is on the syllabus, but then also I will set up a discussion board where you can ask some questions and we can create some sort of FAQ. So to get us started, I just want to talk about the purpose of the course. Really, this is getting you familiar with some of the key findings of adolescent development and how they learn and how this may be beneficial for you as you design and deliver your lessons and create relationships with your students. We also want to emphasize some culturally responsive underpinnings and growth mindset processes that will also help your students in their academic journey. So the first thing I'd like for us to do is just kind of look at some case studies, very different. You may have heard of the people that we're going to be discussing. As I'm kind of introducing you to these three students, I want you to think about, if you were a teacher, what were the kind of things that you would see in school? If this was your student, what are things that might be obvious to you? What things may not be completely obvious to you? How might you react to the student? And then we'll start to sort of unravel what ended up kind of happening to these students and what happened to them as an adult. And as we do that, I don't want you to get the idea that because they were one way as an adolescent, this turn them into the person that they end up being as an adult. While some of these ideas, some of these experiences certainly may have shaped the person that they were, there are lots of factors that go into the evolution of an adolescent into adulthood and many other psychological factors that are involved. I don't want to give the impression that this could have been avoided or that any one thing leads to another. Just look at this as if this was a student in your classroom, what things would definitely be red flags? What things might you have missed? How would you proceed with this? So the first person I want to talk to you about is student one. This is a picture of student one. We know that student one had emotional problems from very early on due to a variety of reasons. First of all, he had a family history of an emotional problems in his family. His mother had problems, but she also went out of her way to tell him that his younger brother was preferred. His grandmother was really the only source of affection. He was sexually abused by an older boy when he was only 8 years old. And because he wasn't really getting the affection he needed, there wasn't a whole lot of supervision in the home. He began drinking alcohol at a very early age, and he would actually reach the point of drunkenness by the age of 14, came to school drunk on several occasions, and he often reached of scotch. He was closeted homosexual, and he did not tell anybody of what was happening within him. Maybe he didn't have anybody to tell. Although he was considered an outcast, he really liked to make people laugh. His grades at school struggled, but he still managed to graduate. Once he graduated from high school, his parents divorced, but he didn't really get much relief in terms of affection. There wasn't anybody else really that might be interested in the way he was developing. His new stepmother was very unaccepting of him. He decided to join the army and became a medic. And while he was in the army, his drinking continued to escalate. He later admitted that when he was 14, he had already started to become violent towards animals. His first murder that he committed was right after high school graduation, where he picked up a hitchhiker, took him home, where they had sex, and then when the hitchhiker wanted to leave, he felt that his affection had been rebuffed and he strangled the man to death. Once he was in the Army, his violent tendencies continued to escalate. He repeatedly raped other soldiers. The Army, they just wanted to sort of dismiss him and not go into the allegations any further. So he was actually honorably discharged at the age of 20, approximately 2 years after graduation of high school. Once he returned home, he was arrested and imprisoned several times for lewd conduct and also for exposure to minors. He continued to go on a violent path. Certainly his tendencies towards mutilation and murder escalated. He would get to the point where he was keeping body parts in plastic bags in the freezer, started to actually eat the parts of the bodies that he retained. In 1991, when he was finally apprehended, it turned out that he had killed 17 young men. When he was arrested, he admitted to his crimes and was actually relieved that he was found out, because he just wanted all of the murdering to end. He couldn't get himself to stop. So if you hadn't already guessed, we're talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. Think about what might a teacher have noticed in the classroom. He was trying to make other people laugh. He came to school drunk. What was done about these things? What were other influential factors that perhaps led to what happened in his future? Next student I want to talk about is this woman. This woman was born to sharecroppers in Georgia in 1944, and she was the youngest of 8 siblings. At that time, the Jim Crow laws were in full force, and the plantation owners expected the children that were as young as 4 to work in the fields, but her mother refused to do that and enrolled her in school instead. She was accidentally shot in the eye, and her family could not pay for medical treatment, so she became permanently blind in that eye. She was very shy, but she was very popular in school and excelled. In the background, she struggled with severe depression and anxiety. She was always in fear of disappointing her parents, and she began contemplating suicide in high school. She did graduate from high school as a valedictorian, and she earned a full scholarship to Spelman College and then transferred to Sarah Lawrence. While she was at Sarah Lawrence, she learned that she was pregnant, and she again started to battle with suicidal tendencies. Her friends helped her locate a doctor that would help her get an abortion. But still, after the abortion, that sort of escalated her anxiety and depression. And this is when she began to write about her experiences, and she submitted her writing to a teacher who actually gave them to a literary agent. After graduation, she started to work for the civil rights movement, working with such leaders like Martin Luther King, and she continued to write about her experiences. She married young, and she married a white man in Mississippi. Her marriage was the first legally married interracial couple in the state's history. She continued to write poems during her depression. Her depression took a more serious turn when she lost the baby soon after Martin Luther King's death. She felt that it was a result of the stress of Martin Luther King's death. She went on to publish a third novel. She actually went on to win the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and in 1986 the novel was made into a movie that received 11 Oscar nominations. So this person was Alice Walker. She still battles, from what I understand, she continued to battle with a depression for many years. Again, what would you have seen as a teacher? She is very popular. She is loved by all. She is doing great in her classes, but yet at home, she's contemplating suicide. So there's a facet on the outside and a facet on the inside. What could you see that could possibly get the student the help that they might need at the time? Not saying that your intervention could make any difference in the long run. What are some things that might sort of hide what's really happening in the background? The next student I'm going to keep as sort of a hidden student, and I want you to kind of think about what are things that now, after we've seen a couple of the case studies, what are things that might pop up now that you might think, oh, this is something that I definitely want to get the student help for. These are things that I wouldn't know about. What things might be beneficial to know? So student 3, the mother drank heavily and the father physically abused him for a long time. He avoided going home, and so he spent a lot of the times in the streets, and by the time he was in his mid-teens, he had already been arrested for delinquency 24 times. It's many times. He was in and out of detention centers. He rarely went to high school. He didn't graduate from high school. He joined the Navy at 17. After he was discharged from the Navy, he completed his GED and started to attend community colleges, but he still struggled with drugs and alcohol. When he was 18 or 19 years old, he was in a serious car crash when he was driving under the influence, and at that point he decided that maybe it was time to stop and start to distance himself from his friends. By this time, he was working for a high-end furniture store where a wealthy client ended up taking interest in him and started to mentor him. Through his connections with this wealthy customer, he started working at a rehabilitation center and also working with a neurosurgeon. He went on to finish his undergraduate degree and specialize in thoracic and foregut surgery, and he got married and started a family. He published numerous medical journals, received tenure and full professorship at the University of Minnesota. He became chief of thoracic surgery for the University of Minnesota, and he has been recognized through a documentary on PBS and awards like Best Doctors in America and Top Doctor in Thoracic Surgery. So this person's name is Michael Medeiros. Think about what are the things. Certainly he started off really badly. He started off in getting in trouble. He had the same sort of abusive history as many of our students did. But something happened in his life that managed to turn things around instead of having him necessarily go down a less than successful road. Now, just because someone manages to get out, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will not struggle. For example, the same person actually lost his medical license for some time because he went back to using opiates. It's not always going to be a straight path. Knowing that one person can go the path of perhaps a Jeffrey Dahmer, right, which is an extreme case, I understand, which can certainly be qualified by many as just evil, and then go down the path of Alice Walker, who had a very productive path and was able to bring herself up from very humble beginnings to creating and battling depression, which we now realize is a huge obstacle to overcome in one's life, and then lead a life of where her work is being turned into movies. But then also someone can lead this path where they're not doing very poorly. Certainly Michael Medeiros started off with a very difficult life, managed to turn himself around, and then his demons came back to influence his life again. As teachers, we don't have control over what's going to happen to someone and how they're going to react. But we as teachers do have relationships with our students. We see them on a regular basis, and we can use what we know about what adolescents go through, their bodies go through biologically, what their minds go through both cognitively and psychologically, their reactions to social and emotional pressures. And we can use that in order to get the students the help that they need, and also give them the classroom experiences that perhaps can lead to a more productive future. That's the big takeaway. Always be on the lookout when you see your students. What do you know about them? What makes sense in terms of their psychosocial development, their biological development? What can we help them with? What can other more experienced staff members of the school be able to help them with? And then also there comes a time where we have to understand that we can't fix people. The next thing I kind of want to do is look at what are some stereotypes for adolescents, because sometimes stereotypes can often influence our ideas. And so just think to yourself, what are some of the stereotypes that you might have for adolescents? And if you need to pause the video to kind of give yourself a moment to stop and think about it, please do. Some people may say that adolescents are lazy, that they are egocentric, that they are transfixed on immediate gratification, that they have it easy these days, whatever it is. I can tell you that if we think about examining adolescence through a different lens, that really adolescence is one of the single largest growth periods in human development outside of, and there's multiple levels of this development. And we're going to go through each one in detail. There's biologically, cognitively, and socially. And then it's also happening in multiple contexts. It's happening in family, school, community, peers, and friendships. And it's not a process like the development of childhood, but it's really functionally and qualitatively different. They're shaped by a lot of social and educational practices, peers and friendships, trends, and we see a lot of them even more today in a technological age. Throughout this time, they're also shaping and developing their identities. Our interactions with them may become part of who they are becoming. What kind of information are we sending our students? What kind of cues are we setting off? Looking at adolescence, a historical perspective, really looking at adolescence started the beginning of what we consider general academia. Plato kind of gave the idea that when somebody reached adolescence, it was really the time for them not to play anymore, for them to settle down, become thinkers. That childhood was the time where students should play sports and games, but really by the time that they're teens, they should settle in and start learning the things that were important in life. Aristotle really saw the idea that students should have the ability to choose what they want to do, that this was the time, the adolescence was a hallmark of their maturity, really sitting down and deciding what are they going to do for the rest of their lives. Now that idea may seem a little bit foreign, right? We think of students still kind of starting to explore new things. Looking into the Middle Ages and looking at adolescence, we didn't really have a lot of information about adolescents and teenagers. There were very few medieval teenagers that actually were able to have a formal education. It was relatively rare. It was very rare, actually. And children were actually viewed more like miniature adults than children. You can see this in the way that paintings show them dressed. Really, they're not dressed any different than their adult counterparts. They would often be sent off to work as apprentices for backbreaking work like farming, blacksmithing, carpentry. And also, too, you can look at the way adolescents were punished. There was severe punishment. Adolescents, teens, I guess I could say to make it shorter, acted up. There was no such thing as reportable child abuse. There was, they had the sort of like spare the rod, spoil the child type mentality. And so towards the end of the Middle Ages, the economic situation shifted dramatically. Many of the occupations switched from requiring manual labor, necessitating academic skills. So the treatment of children became refocused away from the integration with adults and towards educational instruction. Rousseau had a very different idea of children. He saw adolescents and teens very different than adults. He saw them as innocent, they were vulnerable, it was not unusual for them to be slow to mature, and they were actually entitled to freedom and happiness. In other words, he had the idea that children were naturally good, and the importance of developing ideas for themselves should be paramount, that they should be allowed to make sense of the world in their own way, and they should be protected from ideas that were beyond their grasp. As we started getting into the 19th and 20th century, they started to take sort of this inventionist view, which was the view that adolescence is a socio-historical creation. Especially important in this view are the socio-historical circumstances at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is the time where legislation was enacted that ensured the dependency of youth and made their move into the economic sphere more manageable. We started seeing education of children as being free and also compulsory. And by compulsory education, I mean that educational attendance was required of all students. In the United States, by the way, the range of which compulsory education is enforced can differ from state to state, but usually it's someplace in between 5 years old and 18 years old. But some states allow students to, after 16, for it not to be compulsory, and also students as young as 4 years old for it to be compulsory. So it just kind of depends on the state. Why we saw this is because we saw children just being hurt in factories. The industrial age was turning into a more dangerous place. The jobs that adolescents had to take were just considered to be inappropriate for children that young. In the 19th century, who they considered to be like the father of adolescent psychology is G. Stanley Hall. And he came up with the idea of storm and stress as the biological foundations. He suggested that storm and stress was an inevitable part of adolescent development. His storm and stress hypothesis referred to the decreased self-control seen in adolescence, which he considered to be the storm, versus the increased sensitivity in adolescence to various arousing stimuli around them, which he considered the stress. And he considered storm and stress to affect adolescent behavior in 3 different ways. First, there would be a conflict with parents. There would be mood disruptions, and they would engage in risky behaviors. And though not all adolescents necessarily go through storm and stress stage of development, Hall's ideas about adolescence were fairly popular for their time. In the decades that followed, researchers and academics have tried to place their own spin on Hall's developmental hypothesis and whether adolescent tension was due to biological factors or upbringing. And also, so this kind of started to mark the turn of the century where educators, counselors, and psychologists began to develop norms for behavior in adolescence. The next time we see kind of more information moving towards understanding in the adolescence or a different take on this is in the 20th century, 1928, and Margaret Mead's sociocultural view of coming of age in Samoa. So in 1925, Margaret Mead journeyed to the South Pacific territory of American Samoa, and she sought to discover whether adolescence was a universally traumatic and stressful time due to biological factors, or whether the experience of adolescence depended on one's cultural upbringing. She spent about 9 months observing and interviewing Samoans, as well as administering some psychological tests. And finally, she concluded that adolescence was not a stressful time for girls in Samoa because Samoan cultural patterns are very different from those in the United States. Since then, her views have been challenged, and I'm not going to go into that so much. I'm not an anthropologist, but I did want to at least I'm kind of just giving you the historical perspective here of kind of how we've started to come up with the ideas surrounding adolescent development to this day. So as we work, we talked about the stereotypes that exist for adolescents, things like they're lazy, they don't want to work, they're just thinking about sex, they want to do drugs, they're just concerned with their social media, etc. I want to also let you know that there exists this thing called the adolescent generalization gap. And that's the idea that generalizations that we make about adolescence is based only on a limited, highly visible group of adolescents. That there's other things kind of going on in the background that may not necessarily be what we automatically assume is happening with adolescents. Another thing to kind of keep in mind too is that adolescence can occur very quickly. There's changes happening all the time, and the picture on the left is a picture of a student that was taken in August of 2007, and then the same students in April of 2008. There's been huge changes to them. If you notice the boy in the center, he's now taller than the girl, or maybe she's bending over a little bit. The youngest boy looks completely different to me. I don't know that I would necessarily have even recognized him. The point is what may be true at the beginning of a school year when you first meet a student may not be true at the end of the school year, and things can happen very quickly. Thinking about today's adolescents, I don't know about you, but things have, for me, when I'm thinking about high school, I think it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I think of all the friends and the memories and the life lessons, but then I still am haunted by some embarrassing moments. So really thinking about the contexts in which development occurs and how it's influenced by historical and economical and social factors also has to kind of be kept in the forefront. As far as developmental processes, I think I mentioned we're going to talk about developmental changes that are a result of biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional processes. They very much intertwine. There's nothing that's happening strictly biologically or strictly cognitive that isn't being influenced by the other factors. It's the idea that all these things are happening at the same time, and that we have to kind of synthesize what's happening with our students, to what extent, and where do they fall in the continuum. So just to qualify, or just to define, I should say, these processes, I want to define biological processes as physical changes to the body. Cognitive processes are changing in thinking and intelligence, and socio-emotional processes as changes in relationships, emotions, personality, and social contexts. Also, in terms of defining the periods of development, I want to also define these terms as well. Adolescence considers many factors, and they're very blurry transitions. So it's not like middle school is early adolescence, and then as soon as they get into high school, it turns into late adolescence. Some students might reach some of the characteristics of late adolescence earlier or later than others. And also, adulthood is not homogeneous. But if we want it early adulthood is late teens and early 20s, yes, but there might be people that are very mature for their age or very immature for their age. So while I may refer to it as early adolescence, late adolescence, adulthood, just keep in mind that these lines are very blurry, and a lot of it has to do with the individuals themselves. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here and make another video that will start with the 2 major changes of adolescence.